And the idea of punk rock continuing after the death of Sid Vicious, like you mentioned earlier, like the Pistols breaking up, etc. But you know, so when I first started hearing about Black Flag and Circle Jerks continuing to make like punk rock music, I thought like, dude, it's kind of over. You're supposed to be weird.
Hello, and welcome to the DC Rock History Podcast. My name is Philip, and we have an incredible episode. Today we're talking about the Faith Void split with Thurston Moore. Thurston Moore is, of course, a founding member of Sonic Youth, and just wrote a memoir called Sonic Life, which I highly recommend. We got to talk to him about a lot of what's in the book because it weaves really nicely into our conversation. The book is centered around the music that he played, the music that he listened to, the bands he went to see, which included The Faith and Void. So it was an awesome conversation. It's a little longer than usual. We didn't get to our listening section, so slightly unconventional. I'm going to drop some of the songs in along the way so you can hear them. Of course, we're going to have a hardcore history segment up top. We're actually going to have two for The Faith and for Void because this is a split. There's a lot to get into in this episode, starting with the hardcore history segment, so let's get into it.
Flex your head. It's time for some hardcore history.
The Faith formed in 1981 in Washington, D.C. during a pivotal moment when many of the city's first wave hardcore bands were dissolving or on hiatus. The lineup featured Ian MacKaye on vocals, Michael Hampton on guitar, Chris Bald on bass, and Ivar Hansen on drums. All four members were still in high school when the band began, and several had previously played in early DC punk acts like the Untouchables and SOA. Faith quickly earned a reputation for their sharp, emotionally driven take on hardcore. Their side of Faith Void Split was recorded at Inner Ear Studios and released in 1982 on Dischord Records. Though the band broke up in 1983, their influence carried into future DC acts like Embrace and Rites of Spring, helping bridge the gap between hardcore and emerging post-hardcore sound. Void was formed in Columbia, Maryland in 1979 by John Wiffenbach, Bubba Dupree, Chris Stover, and Sean Finnegan. Unlike most DC hardcore bands, Void incorporated elements of heavy metal into their music, resulting in a chaotic and unpredictable sound that stood them apart from their peers. Their early performances, including basement shows and bills at the Wilson Center, were marked by speed, volume, and improvisational energy. After recording a demo in 1981 at Inner Ear Studios with Don Zantara, the band was invited by Ian MacKaye to contribute to a split LP with Faith on Dischord Records. Released in 1982, the Faith Void Split showcased Void's raw, genre-bending approach to hardcore. Although the band disbanded by the end of 1983, their influence extended into the noise rock and metal scenes, with artists citing them as an early inspiration for blending punk aggression with sonic experimentation. Hello, and welcome to the DC Rock History Podcast. My name is Philip, and we have an unbelievable episode today. We have our dream guest, but before we get to that, let me check in with my co-pilot, Alex. Alex, how you feeling today?
Feeling spicy today. I'm feeling spicy. I'm ready to take the world by the tail and make it give me everything it has.
That's what happens when you listen to the Faith Void Split. You get a little bit of the sweet and the sour, and you're ready to go.
Got me charged up.
Well, our guest today is an absolute musical hero of mine. He quite literally changed the way that we think about guitars. He wrote or was a part of some of my favorite albums of all time. He is a poet. He is an author. He was the founding member of Sonic Youth. He's worked with everyone from Patti Smith to Chuck D and Homer Simpson. Welcome to the DC Rock History Podcast, Thurston Moore. How are you feeling today?
I'm feeling pretty good. I guess I'm spicy as well.
What's got you spicy in your neighborhood?
Well, I'm living in London these days, and they're not. It's not really sort of a spicy demographic here, but I have to, when I go to the States and visit my family, I always bring back some caliente.
Well, like I said in the intro, it's an absolute honor to have you here. I've played Daydream Nation so many times, I can't even tell you. So it means quite a bit to me that to both of us that you're here, and we are talking about what I know is an important release for you. But I want to start before we get into all the Faith Void talk. with just a little bit on your book. I just finished it yesterday. It's a terrific read. You're a great author, and for someone like me who is got their head in all the rock history, factoids that I can find. It's just a dream read. I mean, it goes through your life, but it's so intertwined with the music that you played, the music that you listened to, the musicians that you played with, and I thought maybe as like sort of a setup for today's discussion, maybe could you talk about the bit in the book where you discuss the Sex Pistols' final show in San Francisco, and how that was sort of the end of something, and then sort of laid some fertile ground for what was coming next. In your case, there was the no wave scene in New York. In DC, obviously, it becomes hardcore, and there's New York hardcore bands as well. But what do you think about that as a jumping off point? How did you, even from like a more direct like question here. How did you get yourself back in that headspace of like remembering all those shows? Because you go into all the shows you went to in such great detail. It's awesome. It's like you're right there with you when you're reading the
I
book,
don't
and I
think
loved
my
that.
I don't think my experience as such is that dissimilar to a lot of other young people's experiences. Mine being sort of mid to late 70s into the 80s and onwards. But anybody uh, whose experiences where they're really obsessed about music and what music, whether it's punk rock or whatever, to be their vocation. It's not that dissimilar from anybody else's experiences. I had people, who were born a decade after me, who I would be working with as musicians, saying like, "Oh, I wish I had I wish I had been able to experience that scene that you did experience at the time in New York." And I was like, "Well, you're experiencing something really just, specific to your life. So it's not any better or worse." But that said, it was the advent of something that was really sort of a changing of the guards as far as like, youth culture and rock music culture, and creating like a sort of a very sort of significant alternative to uh, how to conduct yourself in youth culture. Hardcore was very significant in that respect, but even punk rock as well. It was sort of getting away from the idea that it was all about wanting to attain success as represented by money, or this kind of glamorous lifestyle, and taking it back to the reality of just like passion and and living hand to mouth and doing it for the love of the music. One of the first songs that really touched me was when there was this live double album called Live at CBGB that came out really early on, that didn't really document like all the bands you heard about playing at CBGB, because there was no Television or Talking Heads or Patti Smith on that album. It was all these other sort of secondary and tertiary bands on there. Even though the Talking Heads are seen playing in the background on the stage, they're not on that record. It's like it's bands like that you never would hear about again, like a band called Sun. Well, one band called Tough Darts was on there, and they kind of had a bit of a pedigree. And the first song on that record is by that band Tough Darts, and Robert Gordon, who became a bit of a, a more well-known, kind of rockabilly punk singer after leaving Tough Darts, the solo career. The that Tough Darts song with him singing on that record, the first song is called "All for the Love of Rock and Roll," and the lyrics are like, "I don't, I'm not in it for the money. I'm not in it for, I ain't seen none. I ain't in it for the women. I only need one, all this kind of stuff." And it's all for the love of rock and roll. And it's just like that kind of sentiment was not being espoused by Led Zeppelin and Yes and ELP and, and or even the Allman Brothers, for God's sakes. So that was really significant for me to hear, and that joy in it, and of course that whole gang was pronouncing this. So that's where it led me into it. I mean, writing the book, I just wanted to write, because I sort of I'm into writing and literature, and I've written quite a bit of essaying and poetry, as you said, But to write a long form book, I used the device of a memoir to do that. And I mean, it allowed me to get like a book deal with, with like a above ground publisher, using a book agent, and getting paid to do it. And so I realized I couldn't just write a book of meta surrealist science fiction, even though I wanted to. I would never be able to really sell it. But I could write a memoir about the band I was in that had, a bit of a high profile in the kind of, the this kind of subculture we kind of all are fascinated by. Um, and so that was why I wrote the book. It allowed me to write, and I really sort of got into it. So I spent like 2-3 years just like really putting pen to paper and wrote like 800 pages, and it got whittled down to like 400. I was contracted for 300, as my editor would say, like, this is like ridiculous, so it's way too lengthy. And so we spent a year editing, and that editing process to me was also something I really loved to do, just like refining and looking at flow, and how things can move and what's important and what's not important, and to the readership that they, you know, uh, that they regarded at a major publishing house. If I had published it myself, it would be 800 pages, and it would just be all this arcana in there. It would have been, it would have been a full 3 chapters on the faith void split.
Well, when that edition does come out, let me know. I would love to read it. One of the things that's so touching in the book is your relationship with your friend Harold and how he was sort of the first ally that you had in the music world. Do you remember? Yeah, could you just talk about maybe what it felt like to find someone who was interested in driving from Connecticut to the city, someone who needed to be a part of that scene like you did, or maybe you didn't know that at the time, but you were exploring that together.
Yeah, I write about how in the high school culture of like 72, 73, 74, um, I was very interested in what was happening in rock music. I have a brother who's like 5 years older, and so he was bringing those records in the house, the Beatles and the Stones and the Jefferson Airplanes and the whatnot. But I was really sort of struck by certain images of these more sort of subversive acts going on. So when I would see a picture of Iggy Pop, or at the time Iggy Stooge, standing on the audience's hands, spray painted silver, like, pointing out into the distance, I was just like, who is that? What could that possibly sound like? And it wasn't so easy where you could just like, go online and listen to it. You had to sort of go to the record store and say, do you have this? And they would say, no, nobody has this. And there would be this record catalog that all the record stores had, which was called the Schwinn record catalog. And it was basically for classical record buyers, but it had to carry pop and jazz. And so going to the Schwinn catalog, they, oh yeah, Elektra Records released the Stooges record. We can order it for you. I was like, I don't really have any money anyway. So it was just this kind of luck of the draw that you would come across it in a cutout bin, like at Woolworths or something. And those cutout records were like 49 cents. And those are the ones that you could afford as a kid looking for like your own records. And so those are the ones I bought. Most of them were really just garbage, but a couple of them were insane. It'd be like, I'm on Duel record that United Artists had put out. Like nobody bought that record. And they just cut the corner off. It's called a cutout. And they job allotted to all these department stores, and it's 49 cents. There's like, there's like 30, 40 copies of them in a bin. And I used to see them all the time. Egg Bamyasi record with a can of okra on the front. Like I would look at that and go like, what band in God's name would put a can of okra on the front of their cover and call themselves Can, It was really went against like what was popular in rock music at that time, whether it was Joni Mitchell or Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. And so, but I was really kind of like, just really curious. Like, what is this kind of this subversion in this music that's already priding itself on being subversive in the culture by being counterculture? Like, what could this possibly be? This is like going against everything. And seeing this first Stooges record with those 4 guys just looking so just like that, the scowls on their faces, and I was very curious what that sounded like. Again, 49 cents, and there'd be like a ton of them in the record bin. You find a first pressing of the Stooges record these days, it's not exactly 49 cents, but in 1972, 73, it was. Nobody considered that record at all. And I remember buying it, taking it home, and just being astounded by how minimal it was. And again, like, who would make a record like this? It's barely 3 or 4 chords, and the lead guitar, it just sounds like it's going through like a like like a blender. I was just like, "There's nobody making records like this except for these guys. Who are they making it for?" But I didn't know that there was, like, a small little scene in Detroit where these guys were kind of, cool, and, like, some critics, like Lester Bangs, would write about, but nobody else would pay attention. And that it was laying the template for bands like the Ramones and on this side of the ocean, and the Sex Pistols on the other side of the ocean, but it's like when you first heard about the Ramones and they said, "We all met each other because we all listened to this first Stooges albums." Nobody else did, and I related to that when I remember reading that interview with them. I was like, "Yeah, I mean," so Harold was a kid that came up to me, and he knew that I had my ear to this kind of stuff because I was bringing in, like, weird rock magazines. At that time, they were kinda weird, but a magazine like Cream magazine, or even like Circus magazine, which was like, they were all kind of music magazines you could buy in the grocery store, but, most kids bought Hot Rod magazine, or Sports Illustrated. And I bought those too because I was, like, looking for, like, cool vibes, but those rock magazines were far more interesting to me, and I felt like I was the only one buying them in my community. I would get kind of threatened by jocks in school, like, "What are you reading? Like, what is this? This is log hair, these long hair fags in this magazine," and they would throw the magazine to the ground because they picture of Todd Rundgren or something with, like, colored hair. They're like, "Well, this magazine is full of, fags." And then when I met Harold, he was like a very effeminate, swishy, like, gay kid. And he didn't come out because that would just be certain death in high school, but he was obviously that, and people kind of left him alone, but he would get pushed up against the lockers quite a bit as well. And I was fascinated by him because his otherness attracted me. It wasn't a sexual thing. It was just this idea of otherness that I found attractive in seeing pictures of, say, Iggy or something. And so I was minding my own business when he ran up to me and said, "Patti Smith is playing in Westport, Connecticut tonight. Like, let's go." Because he knew that I was the only person in that society of that high school that would have any inkling of who that was and would possibly want to go, and he was interested. And we went. We commandeered some other kid's car who we knew was not going to be, antagonistic about this. And he just thought, "Oh, you go to a rock concert? Yeah, let's do it." And everybody's like smoking weed and whipping down the winding roads of, Western Connecticut to Westport. And we got there, and there was seats. They were probably like $5 or something. And it was completely amazing. It was before Horses came out, and she was
Oh,
like,
wow.
Patty comes walking out on stage with a leather jacket, like Marlon Brando or something, and kind of whips it off and slams it on the drum riser and just go 1, 2, 3, 4, and they jump into like the Velvet Undergrounds. We're gonna have a real good time together, just like garage band style. And I knew right away. I was just like, "Oh, this is amazing," because the only music I had seen at that point was just sort of some flaccid arena rock stuff, you know.
And that's an interesting tie-in because Lenny Kaye and Patti Smith are both musicians and writers. So did you clock that at the time that maybe these are people
I
who are
had
doing? Yeah.
Yeah, I had already kind of clocked that because I had sent away for "Hey Joe," the 7 she did, and
Hmm.
the reason I sent away for it was because I had seen her byline as a rock writer. It was all lowercase, Patti Smith, and her writing was really curious because it was always this very prosaic, celebratory, kind of writing about, the record, but not about the record, just about,
Hmm.
being in love with rock and roll and being in love with music and art and just sort of
Hmm.
like giving it this whole patina of like a critique that was based on like, the heart and soul of reacting to the music, as opposed to like, this is their third album and they've reached this other pinnacle of, none of this kind of analysis that you would reach in most kind of like white male rock criticism. So she was very curious. And then when I saw photographs of her in Cream magazine, when they would publish some of her poetry, and she looked like a female Keith Richards standing on the New York subway's platform, photographed by like Gerard Malanga, the Warhol Factory, and all these like kind of signifiers just like everywhere. That androgyny was just like really important to see. So when she put out that first 7-inch, it was like, oh, this writer made a record. Like, how audacious is that? This breaking down of boundaries in a way. What could a rock writer sound like? And she wasn't the first one who did that. There was a few other like kind of rock journals who had their hand at making records and meeting bands. Nothing of any note really, but this one was certainly astounding. I remember getting it and just thinking there's something so Spartan about it when I first heard it, Hey Joe and Piss Factory, that it just like, it just wiped out everything around it. It was just like, okay, forget all the effluvia of like what I like about, the symphonic rock or whatever the hell was listening to. But, so that really, and it also sounded like something that I could actually do and attain, cause I was just like, I had anxiety about wanting to sort of really study technique and become Jimmy Page or something. I was just like, I didn't really feel like I wanted to be that. I wanted to play guitar. I wanted to be more like what I was hearing on these rougher rock records. But the Patti Smith record was so minimal that you would just hear like Tom Verlaine playing like really sort of scratchy percussive guitar lines on the end of I think it's on the end of Hey Joe. Yeah, on Hey Joe. And Piss Factory is just a piano, and her just like doing a recitation, poem. And so the other, that was just like, for me, is like, oh, you could be a polymath. You could do everything. You can be a writer and a musician and an artist. And you could just like, that kind of interdisciplinary activity in rock. I don't think it was anything new, but it was certainly, she kind of exemplified it in a way that it was part of this lineage coming out of like beat culture, kind of avant-garde work, whether it's just sort of like interdisciplinary, sort of stems from like, John Cage in the late 50s. It's like, okay, we're going to do dance and music and literature, and everything's going to coexist in like equal value on the same platform. Like, which was like we take that so much for granted now because everybody does that. I mean, Beyonce does that, for God's sake. But it's like, in 1957, that was really radical. Everything was pretty structured in like your disciplines. It's like, oh, you do this, you do that, you do that. So to put these things together, all these, that was new. It was pretty much just in the academy. It was just like an academic thing. So for rock and roll, which prided itself on not being an academic music, it was great to hear a writer making such an important record, and of course she continued to do so. So by the time we saw her, I was kind of hip to that, and I was hip to Lenny Kaye for sure. He had a column in Rock Scene magazine called Doc Rock, where you would send letters into Doc Rock and ask questions about like rock stuff. And he's like, "Dear Doc Rock, I bought this record, and what is this band? I don't never heard of them before, and it's really interesting." People would do that. Really just sort of basic questions. And he would put his Doc Rock hat on because he worked at a record store in Manhattan. And Bleecker Bob's, when him and Bleecker Bob were at Golden Oldies or whatever it was. And so he kind of like, he was a scholar of like rock records. And so he could answer these questions in this magazine. And so I wrote a letter to Doc Rock, and I think it did. It got published in one of the Doc Rock columns in the like 73 or 74. I didn't sign it my name. I signed
you remember what you asked?
Yeah, I signed it the old bee fart of Bethel, Connecticut. I wrote, and my doc rock question was like what's the story with cutouts? Like, why are these records like so inexpensive that have why are there holes punched in them? Are they, are they devalued as such? Because I find that those are the more interesting records, something like that.
Yeah.
He kind of answers like, oh, like, those records are because the record companies can't sell them. And so, well, yeah, you can't sell the Stooges record. I'll buy it. But, Wayne County, who the trans rocker in their first wave of punk in New York, also had a column, the Dear Wayne, and I wrote to him too.
So the earliest stages of your writing career were letters.
I
to
wrote
the editor.
letters. I wrote record reviews. I would send to the Cream magazine in 73, 74, 75. Always getting rejection notices from Georgia Christgau, Robert Christgau's other, saying like, it's this is this isn't really up to our standards right now. Cream magazine had pretty radical writers, and it said like you use the F word 42 times in this review. And I was just like, oh, I thought you guys liked that word. It was pretty. My writing. I probably still have them in archives somewhere, but it was pretty puerile, as you can imagine.
I'm gonna eventually tie it back to DC Rock, but I did want to ask, this is just talking about the New York scene, and you're talking about some of these no wave bands and just what inspired you. Were you all listening to any African music at that time? Because there's Ghanaian and Nigerian music from the 70s that sort of mirrors some of the grooves of no wave, and I was just curious if that was at all something that you all were aware of, or if that was just a total coincidence that...
Well, in New York, yes.
In New York,
when I moved to New York, music that coming out of like the African diaspora was everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
But
and I know reggae was important to you.
You heard it a lot in no wave was very concurrent with like the advent of punk rock in New York anyway. A band like the Contortions and Teenage Jesus and the Jerks and Mars, these bands begin around 76, 77, around the same time.
Mm-hmm.
Blondie and Patty and whatnot, television, they start like late 74 all through 75, and they start getting really publicly noticed, certainly in 76, as soon as they start really making records. And they kind of get it together as bands. The Ramones were pretty untogether as a band until at least into late 75, 76, and they started becoming a bit of a force to be reckoned with. But if you can see footage of them from like I think 75, even 74, where they're just kind of like they can hardly go through like a minute and a half song without yelling at each other and like being trying to figure out their moves on stage. That was just it was always just sort of taken for granted that diversity in music was always around. I think there was a certain kind of there was a certain relationship between punk rock as a music that was coming from a lot of means of impoverishment, and it sort of had a voice for like a lot of working class concern, in all communities. I think the relationship between the punk rock and certainly hip hop was always very connective. Punk rock sort of had this really foolish idea of being anti-disco, in some factions, but that was just some kind of tomfoolery. For the most part, disco and punk rock were really kind of very complementary bedfellows, because the music was all about inclusion, and and so anybody who was saying like death to disco or anti-disco was just trying to be funny. Yeah, that was mostly like anti-money, anti-cocaine kind of lifestyle stuff. It had nothing to do with actually, the participants or the people who actually loved both musics. It was interesting recording when we recorded with Public Enemy. I had a talk with those guys about a lot of this, and I was just like, it was interesting in hip hop culture. I noticed there's a lot of outspoken interest in attaining wealth, and attaining like emblems of wealth, like gold chains and all this. Whereas like in punk rock, it's actually that is something that is downplayed a lot. If you're a rich kid playing punk rock, you're kind of like, I'm not rich, kid. I'm actually like, just like, that kind of thing. there was a bit of this kind of like, guilt of middle class. There's this kind of upper middle class guilt or middle class guilt that happened that I would see in like sort of like punk rock dynamics. But it was, had everything to do with like, well, there's one culture that has been systematically, oppressed,
Hmm.
and there's one culture that has not been, and it's primarily punk rock culture was like a white working class and middle class culture, and hip hop was an African American culture, and so, but I think there was, there it was so remarkable when punk and hip hop and punk and go-go and pump, uh, R&B and punk rock really kind of got together, and it got together really early on, I mean, you certainly hear it even a band like Talking Heads, like these nerdy kind of like, sort of intellectual, like white college kids, really bringing in disco music into their, into their songwriting, first album onwards, so it wasn't anything, that wasn't that was always very essential, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, early
It's
suicide is not that far from early Giorgio Moroder or any suicide.
yeah.
It's there's a nihilism or an absurdism that is certainly lost in the, disco side of it, but the sort of like vamping on a drum machine and then synthesizers and all that, there's definitely some overlap there.
You didn't hear it so much in New York hardcore or a lot of kind of like, regional hardcore, but you really did hear it in DC hardcore, and a lot of that happened to be the fact that when you would realize that DC hardcore sort of shared the stage, with go-go so much,
Mhm.
and so there was this and I did notice in first wave New York hardcore, like a lot of those kids with the, the hoods up and the whole crew, they were really interested in early hip hop as well. Going to the Rat Cage and seeing these young kids sitting around, but they were very into like what was happening with Run DMC and to wit, like I mean the Beastie Boys were like an early hardcore band,
Right.
and they immediately started employing their love for hip hop into what they were doing, without any realization that it was going to be this like huge part of their world. I remember
Mhm.
seeing them toying with that stuff early on with like Rick Rubin, just thinking like, yeah, I mean, don't lose your day job, guys. But at the same time, they stuck with it and they developed it and they really like for the love of it, they really sort of became such a big part of that of of that world of hip hop and punk, creating a band like the Beastie Boys, for God's sakes,
Yeah.
this is, uh, it 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 was remarkable, the
Yeah.
respect that they gave and the respect that they got, and it was beautiful to see, it was astonishing, so,
Yeah.
um
They're very uniquely in New York, um, their whole history. And to sort of draw some of the differences between New York and DC. I know that you have said in interviews with Discord and other places that part of what you liked about the Faith so much when you first heard them was how young they were. Why did that strike you? Was it just not people were just a little bit older in the New York scene than they were in
well, I was
what was
older.
happening in
I mean, I
DC?
was I
Yeah.
was was the young guy on the scene, and when I started playing with bands in, like, 78, 79, I was like, I was 18 and everybody else was like 21, 22, and I was like kind of the young kid. And then all of a sudden in around 80, when Sonic Youth starts, um, I called it Sonic Youth for a reason. It was like, we were like Sonic Youth. It was like, and like the people I had been playing with were a little older. I think there was a bit of an affront there. I was like, oh, you're calling your band Sonic Youth. What are we like a bunch of old timers at 23, 24? Um, And so and it wasn't based on any kind of like I didn't even know what I didn't even know that there was hardcore bands but, until around, you know, late 80, early 81 and seeing some bald-headed kids on St. Mark's Place in front of the Sounds record store with leather jackets that said, SSD Control on the back or something. And I had some awareness of, Black Flag in LA, Circle Jerks and Black Flag and this
Mhm.
stuff. And I was getting into that. And when I had first gone to LA in like late 80, early 81, um, to meet like Kim's parents or something. I went to like Rhino Records and they had those records, they had these LA kind of punk rock records. And the idea of punk rock continuing after the death of Sid Vicious, like you mentioned earlier, like the Pistols breaking up and then, Sid Vicious like, offing himself in 79 and this whole thing is like, punk is dead. And then all this kind of more sort of like post-punk experimentalism sort of comes out of that. So to play like sort of like punk rock music the way that the Pistols and the Ramones had been playing it or whatever, the Heartbreakers or whatever, seemed rather redundant at the time. You're basically the new
Mhm.
voices were like, the Gang of Four and the pop group and, Public
Mhm.
Image and, these things that, and so the weirder the better. And so that was my whole thing. I was like, yeah, the weirder the better. I'll go for that. And even though I loved would continue to love, Ramones, Dead Boys, etc. But, you know, so when I first started hearing about Black Flag and Circle Jerks continuing to make like punk rock music, I thought like, dude, it's kind of over. You're supposed to be weird, but they kind of coexisted with the weirdness, and then you started seeing more of an influx of young bands really coming out of Black Flag. And like, that was like this kind of really sort of central information center, or, which is this kind of West Coast like continuing punk thing. And I was curious about that. And I was curious about like Raymond Pettibone's art on these covers.
Mhm.
I liked the song titles of like, with Circle Jerks, Whirled Up My Ass. And I was just like,
Mhm.
what is that? And so, and then hearing these records, they were so brief and short and just like bam, bam, bam. But the songs were so good. I just
Mhm.
thought like, these are really amazing songs. Greg Ginn's guitar playing on all the Black Flag stuff just took it to this other place. Of like, wow, this guitar player is really insane,
Mhm.
and the delivery of these songs. And then hearing that there were bands coming out of that were really creating these regional scenes where Black Flag had been like touring, crisscrossing the country. Dead Kennedy, same thing, playing every little donut shop, they could. And teenagers coming of age who could see bands would go see them. They
Yeah.
weren't going to see Bow Wow Wow, and they weren't going to see these other kind of more older bands. They were seeing bands that were kind of closer to their age. Certainly Bad Brains was really important,
Yeah.
but so I got really, getting paid to come by Bad Brains, finding that 7-inch in a record store in New York, running into those guys, seeing them play. I just like, I mean, that record to me was like, it was the fact that that record sounded the way it did, played at such a clip, and the way that, HR was singing on there. I mean, it was almost like this kind of like a weird art noise record or something. I didn't
Yeah.
think it was hardcore punk. I was like, "What the fuck is this?" This is like, it's like this
Yeah.
kind of like totally like a train falling down the stairs kind of record.
It's
Amazing,
completely singular, yeah. And
amazing. Yeah, yeah,
you write in the book that you met them, you were wheat pasting at the same place or something
yeah.
like that, and yeah.
Somebody, a friend of mine who had been playing with like some art student musician guy, said he had seen them, and he said it was mind blowing. He said, "Oh, like, these guys came out and just like it was so enthralling." And I was like, "Really?" And then I've seen their posters around. I said, "Well, the name is kind of whack. It's like they named themselves after kind of a not the best Ramones song." you know, but so I kind of was put off by that. I was just like, why would you name yourself at like the kind of like one of the lamer Ramones songs? And but yeah, and I saw them putting up their the Bad Brains flyer, and I went over. I just remember going over to them. I said, like, I heard you guys are really good. They had just moved to New York, and they're like, oh, they were really gentle. They were just like, oh,
Yeah.
thank you. Oh yeah, you should come see us play. God bless you, and all this kind of stuff. And I was like, all right, well, that kind of swayed me, and I went, and yeah, it was just like, and that's I think one of the first times I saw like that new NYHC crew.
Mhm.
And I was just like, "What is going on?" And it was not the downtown Manhattan art
Mhm.
inflected intellectual punk rock meets the art world, all this kind of stuff that I was really embroiled in. These were kids who were coming out of the boroughs of Brooklyn, Bronx, and Queens, who had grown up going to the high schools in the boroughs. They weren't kids like me coming in from outside of New York and establishing themselves as young adults in New York to become artists and musicians, etc. These were kids who grew up in the milieu of the concrete jungle, and they were not coming into this music for any kind of, any intellectual stimulation. They were coming into it for this kind of primal the stimulation, and it was talking to them as young men, trying to sort of find a voice outside of, all the chaos that was in their lives, whether it was their families or schools or just just the hardcore state of life, and they found each other, and they kind of played off of each other, and they found out that there's all these missives coming from DC, Detroit, LA, SF, most of the major cities, and then from some of the secondary and tertiary towns around them, like Detroit, like Maumee and around in Michigan. And so I got really interested in that just sociologically, and I really thought all the bands, all the records, everything was really fascinating. I went to Rat Cage and I looked at the wall, and there was Youth Brigade 7-inch. There was
cool.
In My Eyes had just come out, and the First Minor Threat, SOA. And I was like, they were all on Dischord, and I was like, so they must all come from DC. They're all on the same label. It was all new. It was just like 80, 81, coming into 82.
So then, like, the Psychos are coming. They're like a New York hardcore
The
band.
Psychos didn't have a record though. They maybe something happened posthumously with them. But I saw the Psychos quite a bit. They were on a lot of bills. But I was just sort of like, I just swept up all those records. They were like, they were a couple bucks each, as opposed to $2,500 each of them, where they are now on online. But and I thought each one was just like completely fascinating, because they all were like, they all had the same vocabulary. There was just like this idea of, just like the click of the drumsticks, the feedback of the guitar for 1 second, and then like just like and then like, and then just sort of the last song, and then like possibly a 20-second skank breakdown, and then back into the velocity of the beginning, and then it's over. And it's like, they were all, and I actually asked the bass player Bert Kuros about that. It's like, how come, like, what was that bass line that is like so significant to you guys, that do 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 do, that kind of like skank bass line. And and I said, if anybody should know this, he should know this. He was a bass player on so many of those records.
Yeah.
He said, well, it was basically, it was just all of us like trying to play like the Bad Brains. And the Bad Brains were such high technique players. These guys were really, these guys were jazz musicians, and they were like playing punk rock and putting this like total high technique grace into that music with, but it's just like, to expect like, a 16-year-old kid picking up the guitar that week and like trying to play like Dr. No, or it was so, and it sort of had that kind of like, it was like, that's what the beauty of it was. It was just like, it's like, well, I can play these 4 notes, and I
Yeah.
can, and they sort of are informed by the Bad Brains, and it's like, I talked to Don Letts about that when he was doing some punk rock documentary. I was just like, this whole scene of hardcore is really looked upon as like this really sort of ultra white, like white teenager male thing. I was like, but you have to understand the source of it is like these African American guys who came out of DC. Yeah, and there's something that's so incredibly wonderful about that. And it's completely acknowledged. The love for Bad Brains by every single kid in that scene was just like unadulterated. It was fantastic.
Yeah. It's, I mean, Minor Threat, clearly the influence from Bad Brains is really strong, but their musicianship is pretty incredible. What I love about the Faith Void split, especially the Faith side of it, is it really goes off the rails at times and then it comes back on. Like musically, we're not all together, then we're back together and the song is over and we're 2 songs later already. And it feels more like what I imagine those performances might have felt like, where there's stuff on the first 2 7-inches from Minor Threat that's just so perfect that you're like, how are they so good so young? And as someone who has been listening to this music so much for so long, the Faith Voids, like what you get on this record is more of what I actually want to come back to, because it's just that chaos that I'm looking for, and there's something about it. And I think another thing that's interesting is like these are 2 bands that are writing 7-inches and then they get put together. There's something magic about, they don't know that they're going to get put together when they're writing this stuff, but they're kind of writing an amount of material that's meant to be 10 to 20 minutes. And then when you put it all together, it becomes something else.
What do I care when you don't? How can I see? No one me. You like with me. It's always hurt. I know it's me. This hard shit. I didn't want it. What I did. Never did it like I did. I didn't want it. What I did. Never did it like I did. What's hurting me? Now you want me, but I'm not there. What can you say? Just don't care.
It's a
Yeah.
huge record. I mean, it was unsuspecting too. I think, all the DC Dischord records were really like, each one was like a real nugget. And so to make an album just sort of seemed like kind of crazy, because there was so much information on a 7-inch that they were accomplishing. So to make an album was like, oh my God, how exhaustive could that actually be? And so the fact that they split the record between these 2 bands, it seemed to make perfect sense in a way. It's just like,
Yeah.
well, because an album is way too long for we're gonna have like 1,000 songs on it. Eventually that just sort of did come into play. You started having these albums with 1,000 songs on them by these bands, but at that time it seemed very sensible, and nobody really had, unless you lived around DC, you didn't really see those bands, or if you were really into the tight scene in around Philly and New York and Boston, they would have played, you would have seen it. I went to see them, I guess, right when that came out, or around that time, at Great Gildersleeves, which was a club down the street from CBGB that was having hardcore shows quite a bit, and it was kind of a good room, a big room, high stage, but not too high, and it sounded good. Saw a great Minor Threat Black Flag show. So when Faith and Void played, I forget who else played, probably a bunch of New York bands, but it was amazing. And I so wanted to see Void, because of course for me, hearing the Void side of that record, I just thought was like, I mean, the way those two sides of that record reflected each other was really fantastic, because Faith was really had this concision, that was really, like you said, it was like they really could, they were playing in such a manner of concision, but it also sounded like they did it in one take, where they just really had it down, as if they rehearsed that to such a degree that they just blammed it out.
Yep.
And, and the fact that they were so young, like Alex's voice is like still like in the, in this stage of it where it probably he hasn't got his man voice yet. And it's just like, it's really like this, like, it just has this anxiousness to it. And then it even gets a little weird with like Into the Black, which is like is a longer track. What is it, like 2 minutes or something?
Yeah.
But it's this,
Imagine
but it
that.
gets like all this reverb echo and stuff. And it's so like, oh, that's cool. They're like they're getting kind of expansive. But the Void side was like, so many people have said, just sounded like this unhinged beast from somewhere else. And you
Mhm.
heard later that there was a bit of there was like this kind of anxiety of controversy about that record being released with the scene, because it was like the Faith, who were very integral to like the DC hardcore scene, and then Void, they
Mhm.
were kind of coming from Baltimore, and they were a little bit of
Yep.
outsiders, and they weren't really like, they were a little more kind of spurious in the in the dynamic.
Yep.
And but I didn't know that. I didn't know what the politics of that were, but you could sort of feel that they were something else, really,
Yeah.
entirely. The way that the Bubba was just like ripping on his guitar, like with this kind of like Jimi Hendrix at 18 kind of thing. And, and it just like the way the feedback would just spiral in and out of
Mhm.
the fades of the songs. Like it was almost uncontrollable. They just like, like, and the vocals, and how like just like spasmodic they were. It was kind of like a more, it kind of really attracted people like me who are really into more like kind of noisier aspects of music.
Yeah.
And so Void became that band for like, the kind of the egghead kids in the audience. But I wasn't a kid. I was older than I was born in 58, so I was like at least half a gen older than like this new scene of hardcore kids. And I was
Yeah.
always caught in the middle. I was like a little too old for that scene, but I was a little too young for the scene I was already involved with, even with
Yep.
like Lee and Kim. I mean, Kim is 5 years older, and Lee is like 3 years older. And but at that time, those age gaps are huge in some sense. And and so I was always kind of like caught between these different demographics of age, and I always felt that way. And so when hardcore happened, I got so into it, and I felt so like bummed out that I was too old for it in a way. Yeah. And when I would see somebody like Tesco V from the Meatmen, who was more my age, I was like, oh man, but he kind of started it, and he was always seen as like this older perv anyway. He was like in the same, or somebody like or like Greg Ginn and Chuck Dukowski, Black Flag. They were kind of more my age, but they were also kind of elder statesmen.
Yeah.
He started in like really hardcore punk, with like Black Flag. I started in like, college art rock.
And you wore a Void t-shirt on your wedding day, isn't that right?
I certainly did. Yeah. I, I had a connection with DC through this band Urban Verbs. It was like,
Oh yeah.
the,
Roddy France.
so Roddy and his partner at the time, and me and Kim, we worked together as these two couples doing interior painting in like uptown Manhattan for this woman who employed us. And so I knew Roddy. We would kind of like try to waste time together. We would sneak out like that, let's go out, like, do nothing while the rest, everybody else. There was other people in the crew who were working in these places. He was a funny guy. I never really saw him again. I saw the Urban Verbs a couple of times. And
Those are very different bands that you all ended up in.
yeah, and
Yeah.
I had a job in 78, where I took over his brother Chris France, the drummer of Talking Heads. I took over his shipping clerk job in like in a kind of bespoke furniture place in uptown. And so I always had this connection to these guys. I never even met Chris France, but I did know Roddy. And so there was that DC thing, and like there was the bands coming from DC at that point were like really just kind of slightly weirdo, not no wave, but kind of like they had some kind of arty kind of thing going on, like, was it Small Furniture or whatever? What was that band called? The small maybe Alec could remind me, like small business furniture or something. And yeah, so when the DC bands, like Void and Faith and Minor Threat and SOA, it just seems so
Oh, Tiny Desk Unit.
Honey Desk Unit.
Yeah, okay.
Right, yeah.
Yes, we just talked to Bob Boylan about that band. Small furniture.
But I was just like, well, that's a cool name, Honey Desk Unit. And but that collective of that kind of DC hardcore sound really, I just thought was it really had nothing to do with Urban Verbs or True
Yeah.
Factory and Saniacs, whatever. It was
Yeah.
really unto its own thing. And I had friends from DC who came up from the DC music scene, such as Don Fleming and the Velvet Monkeys and this whole thing.
Yeah.
And when they were just sort of like, yeah, those kids didn't really like us so much. And I was like, yeah, but you guys were really good. I remember seeing the Velvet Monkeys like, in 79. I thought they were great. He goes, yeah, half Japanese and all everything. But
Mhm.
he goes, yeah, but the young bands didn't like, they didn't care for us so much. And they just like liked each other.
Yeah.
It's like, and that's kind of like, I like that kind of, I talked to
Tribalism,
Ian.
maybe.
I talked to Ian about this. It's like this idea of like having a gang.
Yeah.
And it's not a violent gang, but it's a gang, and coming out on stage as a gang, coming into the club, and it's like the gangs come together, and it's like that kind of tribalism, and it's just like, yeah, there's that is that kind of ritual of an event is like really
Yeah.
is really amazing. It has a lot of kind of interesting history with it, and it gives a lot of purpose to a lot of people's lives, especially when it's espousing alternative lifestyles that are all about sort of constructive behavior, so it was good. But I also thought the Void side was one that was kind of, I think this band Void is probably not adhering to the strictures of like what's being like talked about in a lot of hardcore lyrics, whatever. It's just like,
Mhm.
take care of yourself. It was just like, fuck that. I'm going to jump off stage. And so when I saw them, that's what happened. It was like the Faith came out and they were so amazing. They really delivered in a way that was like, okay, that I thought Chris Bold was just killing it. And is Mike Hampton in the band? Yeah. Is the guitar? Yeah.
Mhm.
And so to me, they really crystallized what I really loved about that concision in songwriting and like hardcore.
Mhm.
It's just like where it's just like the power of the song is like, so it's amazing. And it's not just being cookie cutter either.
Mhm.
And then Void came out and I was really excited. I was like, this is great. And they came out and the first song, I think it was Who Are You? What am I and why am I here? I was just like, it was
Incredible.
fantastic. And they were just Bubba was like screeching. The whole thing was just like a roller coaster. And I was upstairs, like watching down from the balcony going like, this is the fucking coolest band, the coolest show, everything about this. This is like, I can't, for me, it was like, I might as well have been like, 1963 watching the Beatles, like, like at the Cavern or something. I was like, this is amazing. And the singer dude like jumped so high up in the air and he landed and he broke his ankle.
John
all of a sudden,
Whiffenbach.
they had to call an ambulance in, the whole thing, and the show was stopped. They dragged him out of there, they took him to the hospital, and it was over. So Void played one song. It was a great song, and that's the only time I ever saw them or experienced them. And to this day, it kind of like blows my mind. It kind of. Sometimes when I look at old ads in the Village Voice of like the CBGB's hardcore matinees and stuff, because I missed a lot. I saw a lot, but I missed a lot. And I could see like, oh, Void actually played A7 or something.
Mhm.
And I was like, I didn't know. I mean, you know, and I also probably didn't really have the $4, $5, $6 to get in anyway. But so you didn't go to everything because of that. But
Yeah, there's an interesting piece of the puzzle too that Void was from Columbia, Maryland, which is a planned community, and that like it was actually planned by Edward Norton's grandfather, and it had only what's yeah, the actor.
wow.
His grandfather, James Rouse, founded it in, 1967, so it was like a relatively new thing. If you go to Columbia, Maryland, it's between DC and Baltimore, it feels u unique, it's like a little bit cookie cutter on purpose, it's like a planned community. Anyways, and I think maybe there is something in that I can't say definitively, but they're pushing against the structure that they've grown up in, you know, because 'cause they're, like, literally these kids are literally the exact age of the community, so they would have been like, you know, I don't know, it's just an interesting piece of the puzzle, whereas the Faith are more of a downtown band in the
Mhm,
DC scene and all that,
mhm.
but, yeah.
I mean, it's interesting in any scene, like what voices become most prominent. And, you know, it's like I sort of usually sort of have resistance towards the most prominent voices because it's like, well, I'm more into the socialism of the scene. So I kind of like things to have a more of a balance as far as like
Mhm,
what the information is, I guess. And so, but even in DC hardcore, you know, you kept hearing about what was happening with Ian and certainly Henry Rollins and
mhm,
you know, but at the same time, I never got a sense where they were quote unquote lording over the scene at all. And that was like
mhm,
really curious to me. I just felt like, well, they actually are saying really interesting things. And I think in a lot of ways, most people that age aren't really that articulate about
mhm,
what's going on. And to find that articulation happening with anybody is like really curious and interesting and to the benefit of the community. And so I I thought, you know, when I first started paying attention to and reading the interviews with people like Ian and Henry early on, because they were really willing to do interviews and talk about what was happening and talk about the ideas that were happening in the community, you know, and then to find out that Ian actually had he had a kid brother who was also in a band, and he's like 14. Yeah, I was just like, wait, where's this gonna stop? You know, that's even more exciting in a way. It's just like, wow. And then to hear the Untouchables on Flex Your Head, those
yeah,
songs were great. Of course, you know, we even covered Nick Fit, you know, like in a very like kind of like silly way. I wish I could go back and redo that, but we did it the way we did it. And when we did that song, I really wanted to do that song, and I actually wrote to Alec, and he had sent me the lyrics to Nick Fit, and when we went in to record it, I I forgot them or I lost them or something. You know how it is.
Yeah.
There was no internet or anything. There was no like, I probably had it. Probably sent it to me, and I had it at home, and I was like, what happened to that piece of paper?" It was just like that kind of thing. I was just like, "What are you gonna do? You can't like write back again. It's like another month." And so they didn't. There was no. It's not like I went to a Xerox place and copied them or anything. And that's happened a couple of times to me. Richard Hell. We did a cover of "That's All I Know Right Now," which is a song by the Neon Boys, the pre-television band with Richard Hell and Tom
Oh,
Verlaine.
cool.
And I told Hell that we were going to do it, and he actually typed out the lyrics to that song and signed it and gave it to me. He said, here's a lyric.
Wow.
And again, I couldn't, I don't know where the hell I don't know what hell happened to him. And I was just like, to this day, I was like, man, that would be so cool to have but Alex typed out lyrics of Nick Fit would have been really cool to have too, but I don't know what happened to it. And so I just sort of sang, I had to sort of like, God, what I just made up words in the studios, and that's like, nobody's going to understand what I'm saying anyway. But it just sounds like somebody who doesn't know what they're saying. I mean, it was just like that kind of bullshit. And so to this day, I regret recording it that way. I should have left it alone. But we played it live quite a bit too, and I started making up more sensible lyrics that I thought would fit.
Well, we didn't quite get to our listening section, but is there anything else before we go that you want to say about the DC scene, Faith Void split? Anything you want on the record?
I have now, are people seeing this on this blog?
If that's all right with you, yeah.
Oh, I didn't really look in the mirror today. That said, look at this record I got. This is like the Japanese
Oh, wow.
Faith Void present. I've had this for a while. I
Wow.
kind of dug it out of my record collection.
Wow.
So what happened? What I think happened is that the distributor of this Dischord record created their own obi to put on the record, and I got this a while ago from Disc Union, the Japanese record distributor.
Jesus, that is cool.
That's pretty cool looking.
That's cool.
Oh, and also, one thing I want to say about this record is that this photograph is by Malcolm Rivera,
Mm-hmm.
who's a very good friend of mine. I used to play with him in like this rebooted Velvet Monkeys kind of group with Fleming and myself and Malcolm. And Malcolm was Grand Mal, and Malcolm was one of the first guys with a camera who was actually shooting around.
Yeah.
And he told me a great story about that record cover. He said like, yeah, somebody from Faith came up to me when that record came out at 930 Club and said, "Oh, you should have a copy of this. Your picture's on the front." And he was just like, "Wait, you didn't ask me or anything." He said, "But that's how it was back then. It was everybody just kind of like, it was such a micro community. It was a micro scene, and there's a certain beauty of that. Like I used to put like my home address on like the first couple of Sonic Youth records, and somebody finally called me. I was like, "You probably shouldn't do that." People know. I was like, "Why? No, who cares about us? We all know each other anyway." And it's just like, anyway, because I always thought that story was really, Malcolm is no longer with us, and his collection of photographs of that world and that era are so amazing. And I hope someday somebody will compile them together and put them out. I tried to, but it's such an expenditure to put a book together. I have like 5-6 different book ideas that I'm always working on at any given time. But
well, I look forward to
an extensive interview with Alec and Ian and Malcolm at Dischord House a few years ago, where we sat down and really talked through all these photographs, and so it does exist.
I'll have to find that. I haven't seen it. That's
Well,
that's cool.
nobody has it except for
Nobody. Okay.
on my iPhone.
See? Well, send it our way when you do.
Yeah, okay.
This has been an absolute dream. Listeners, go check out Flow Critical Lucidity, Thurston's new album. And
That
I
record
mean,
right there.
by all means, go read this book, Sonic Life. It's fucking awesome. I loved it. It's up there for me with Just Kids of the great music memoirs. So,
No, thank you.
and Alex, please.
Hey, if there's a lot of good takeaways from today's show, Thurston, thank you so much for your time. It's been extremely valuable information, but I just wanted to highlight one particular thing that you said, which is find your voice outside the chaos of life. I think that is a wonderful bit of advice for anyone, no matter what you do in life. Find your voice outside the chaos of life.
Indeed.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to drop in some songs along the way. Thanks again for hanging out with us. This has been a dream. And
Anytime, you know where to find me.
Awesome. Very cool.